Hello, this is Mocha Product Manager Martin Brennand, and today we're going to use Mocha's PowerMesh, the Stabilize and Insert modules to fix some pants. In this case, we're going to be looking at some ripped jeans, and while this is a fairly simple patch job, it also presents some challenges to make it look realistic. We can't simply paint a still clean plate over the rip, as there's numerous lighting changes and the wearer deforms the cloth as they move about. So what we're going to do instead is stabilize the left butt cheek and flip it over to the right. So we're going to start by grabbing Mocha Pro. Going to come up here to Effect, Boris Effects Mocha, Mocha Pro, and this loads our effect straight onto our layer. And we've got our nice large friendly button at the top here, so we're going to click that. And here we are inside Mocha Pro. So I'm going to start by tracking this butt cheek over here. So if we scrub through this shot, you can see that as we go through, there's a fair bit of planar motion. So I could just do a perspective or shear track, but the problem is that when we scrub through here, you can see that there's this clench that happens. And this clench is actually going to throw our patch off when we try and use it on the other side, and it's going to make it distortion a problem. So instead, what I'm going to do first is use our mesh tracker to capture all that muscle motion in the left. So we're going to come up to our X-spline tool, and we'll draw a fairly large shape. I'm going to just come around the edge of the pocket here, all the way down here, and I'm just going to capture the edge of the seam here. We might move this a little bit later because we don't want to get this seam in here too much, because when we flip it over, we want to utilize the original seam when we merge over the patch here. So as I said before, I've got shear. I probably don't need perspective in this instance, so I'm just going to jump straight down to mesh. And we can see that it generates an automated mesh based on the salient features inside the shape. So I'm going to actually turn on adaptive contrast to try and get a little bit more detail and generate that mesh again. And you can see now we get a slightly better set of details. So once we've got that, there's a fairly stiff cloth inside the jeans fabric here, so I'm going to actually up my smoothness. Now, smoothness is based on the rigidity of the mesh. So the higher this value is, the less the mesh is going to try and capture the wobble that's going on inside the shape. So it's going to pay attention more to the planar track and less to the inside details. So I'm going to pop that up to about 80, because I only really care about the big movements that happen in this. So then we can go ahead and start tracking. I'm going to speed up the recording while we do the track so you don't have to sit through it, and we'll come back when it's done. All right, so we've got our mesh track done now, so let's go through and see that in motion. So we can see that's now, you see here the mesh is now following that little clench of the muscle there. So we've got our nice distortion being captured without going overboard. So next thing we want to do here is we're going to start by naming our layer. So I'm going to call this one left jeans. And I'm going to come over to my stabilize tab, and I'm going to choose mesh warp. And we're just going to run through and just see that in process. So you can now see that patch area is stabilizing nicely around that mesh. So I'm going to keep it there for now. And we're going to keep on working in this same project, because when we go back into After Effects, we're going to use this effect a number of times. So we might as well do all of our work inside this layer here. So the next thing that we want to do is track the right side here where the rip is. First of all, we're going to make a foreground shape for this window here, because this window is covering the right side of our jeans. So we're going to come in here and grab our trusty X-spline tool again, and I'm going to draw a fairly rough shape first off, because we only care about just occluding the shape for the time being. So we're going to come all the way around like so. And we can keep it on the base settings for the time being. And I'm going to call this one window matte. So we'll just call that like that. And oh, I must remember to turn off my cog for my left jeans because we don't want to accidentally retrack that. Next, I'm going to do a big shape to track around the rip. I'm not going to do a smaller shape here because I want to get the overall motion of the right-hand side of the jeans here. So we're going to grab the X-Spline tool again, and we'll draw a fairly large shape around here, just to capture the overall motion here. And when we've got that in place, I'm going to drag it below my window mat so it occludes. So if I turn on my mats here, we can see that this window shape is cutting out the shape below it because everything at the top of the stack is closest to the camera, anything at the bottom of the stack is the furthest away. So we want our layer to be in the middle here. So I'm going to call this one right jeans track, like so. So now we have two tracking cogs on because we can track these together. And now we can start tracking forwards for both of these. So once again, I'm going to speed up the recording here and come back when it's done. Alright, so now we have our pants and our window track done. So let's just scrub back through and have a look. So that's capturing all that motion quite nicely. And that's going to be enough for our needs on this side. We're going to go back into this later and do a little bit of a refinement mat around the rip itself. But for the first stage, this is all we need. And I'm also going to refine the mat on this window. We only care really about the mat that's covering the jeans area, so we're just going to refine that. And that will probably do. Now we can close and save and start putting all this together. So we're going to close and save our project. So back in the After Effects timeline, the first thing we're going to do is duplicate our original layer with the effect on it. So I'm going to do Control or Command D to grab that. And then I'm going to call this one Stabilized Jeans. And before I do any further work on this, I'm going to pre-compose this layer. So I'm going to do Command or Control Shift C to pre-compose. We're going to call this just Stabilized Jeans Comp. And I'm going to move all the attributes into the new composition. So let's click OK on that. So now let's double click on the jeans and go inside the layer. So here we are here. We've got our Stabilized Jeans. I'm going to come up to Module Renders. I'm going to come down to Stabilize Unwarp because we want to unwarp the clenching that happened in those jeans there. And I'm going to click Render. And now when we scrub through the shot, we're going to see that that patch is stabilizing nicely. So now that we've done this, however, we need it to be on the other side. Now, a fun thing about the Mocha Pro effect is that it's always working on the original clip unless you pre-comp it. So I can go ahead and make manipulations to this clip and it won't translate inside the Mocha Pro track, which means that I can come and press S here for my scale. I'm going to unlink the scales together and make this -100 to flip it horizontally. And even though I flipped it horizontally here, it's not going to mess up my track because my track is still looking at the original clip. So now we have that stabilized frame on this side of the comp. So once we've flipped that around, we can go back into the main jeans. So let's go back over to main jeans. So we can see now it's flipped over here. I'm going to turn off those stabilized jeans so we don't see them. And down in Ripped Jeans Original, we're going to come to the original effect we did with the work on. And under Module Renders, I'm going to come down to Insert Layer and choose Stabilized Jeans. Now we'll come and do this rendering part here in a second, but now we need to go back into the original effect and set up our insert module. Okay, so here we are back inside Mocha. And what I'm going to do now is I've got this little track here, but I'm not going to use it. I'm actually going to use a new mat that's going to link to this track. So what we're going to do is zoom in here. Let's just turn off the right jeans track so we don't see it. And I'm going to draw a new mat around the rip itself. So we're going to grab our X-Spline tool, and I'm going to start up here, and we're just going to draw a fairly tight matte around that rip. So I'll smooth that out a little using my right click and clicking all handles. There we go. And now I'm going to take this and link it back to the right genes track. So we're going to come down to link to track, drop that down and choose the right genes track. And let's call this one genes rip insert. So I'm going to drag that below my window mat just in case. And now when we scrub through here, we should see that mat linking to the original track. Wonderful. All right. So the next thing we want to do is bring in that insert layer that we stabilized. So in the same genes rip insert, I'm going to choose insert clip and choose that insert layer that we set inside the plugin. So you can see here that currently it's very, very small. And this is because our surface, which I'll click on here, is usually the same size as the layer that we've drawn at the beginning. We can fix this by modifying it like this, but the easiest thing to do is come up to this button here, which is the Align Surface button, and that will push our insert to the full frame. So if I scrub through here now, you can see that that insert is now moving relative to the track we did, just expanded to the full dimensions of the footage. Now obviously this is too big, so we now need to go over to the Insert module. Let's come down here, click on this guy, and down here we've got use all foreground layers. I'm not going to use all foreground layers, I'm going to just use the Genes Rip Insert Matte. And now we can see it's sitting inside that matte area. So we probably want to soften this out a bit, but first of all, I'm going to sort of move it into position. Now, at the moment, we could go ahead and modify the surface corners like this and try and get it into position this way, but instead what we're going to use is the warp function inside Insert. So I'm going to click down here, and I'm going to show mesh, and this is way too much detail for what I need, so I'm going to bring my level down to about 2. So we can grab any corner like this and start moving it into position. So you can see how if I move this down, I can start lining up that right side insert to fit the seam on the left-hand side. So I'm just going to tweak that a little bit there. Now the problem we're going to have here is this pocket here, because you can see on the left-hand side that the pocket is much higher than the right. So we're probably going to have to do a little bit of rotation to make this work. So I'm just going to zoom out a little bit, and I'm going to rotate that around. So let's turn off our show mesh for a second. So we're going to pull this corner down a little bit. Let's just zoom out, and we'll drag it over a little bit. So we can start to see now it's fitting about right. Rotate that down a little bit. And then we can turn mesh on and continue tweaking. So I'm going to try and get this seam back to where it belongs. And this is going to take a little bit just to tweak it into the right spot. So we'll continue tweaking and come back when we're done. As we're tweaking here, there is a useful function you can do, which is actually to turn off the layer outline so we can see the edge. Because sometimes the spline itself can get in the way. So let's just turn that off so we can see what we're doing. And you can see quite a rough edge here. So what we might do first is I'll turn those layer outlines back on. We'll grab all of our points like this. And I'm going to just add a little bit of edge width. So you can see down here in edge properties, we've got edge width. I'm going to just increment that a few times to just bring out a little fall off. We can see our outer edge starting to appear here. So we want a little bit of an edge just to make it soften out a little bit. So now I'm going to turn those layer outlines off again by clicking this one right here. So we can see it now, it's fading a little bit more. So let's just keep on modifying the warp here so that we can fit it into position. Okay, so once we're happy with the overall position, we can start now tweaking the fall off on our mat. So let's just turn those layer outlines back on. I'm going to turn my show mesh off so I can see what I'm doing here. And I'm going to use the Alt key by holding that down, Alt or Option, and just selecting a point and dragging the outer point down so I can get that fall off. So you can see I can drag this as far as I like, and we can see how that falls off nicely and starts to blend in. So we'll do this a few times around the edges just to get that fall off. And that's starting to look pretty good. Don't worry too much about the fade here because this matte will cover that when we're over here. So we can make this as large as we like over this side, and then the window will cover up any of our mistakes. Okay, so we've got that now. So the next thing, very important part we need to do is actually play this back to see if it's working. The playback's going to be a little bit slower than usual because we're actually playing back a render from our stabilize on this side and then pulling it back over to the preview on the insert. So I'm going to just come up here and say enable all overlays off, or we can press the tilde key. So now we can see it in full. And that's looking pretty decent. All right, so now we can go ahead and close and save again. Okay, so back in After Effects, now we can go ahead and render that insert. So let's come up to Lens, Insert Composite, and click Render. And now we'll see that stabilized plate being inserted over on the right. So finally, we need to create one more plate over here to get this window in place. So we could do this a number of ways, but I'm going to do the rendered methods. This is just duplicate those ripped jeans again, pull them to the front. I'm just going to call this foreground mats. And then we'll turn off our insert that we don't need to be on the top layer and come up to matte. Under matte, we'll choose visible layers. And we're just going to show the window matte for the time being. So let's click OK. And then we'll choose Apply Matte. So now this matte is covering over the jeans patch on this side. So if we hid that for a second, you can see how much it's covering there. So let's just play this back and see how we're going. And that's actually looking pretty good. We've got an overall capture of the right planar motion of the rip, using that stabilized warp so we get the clench without any weird motion in the cloth. So now that we have these two, there's one little bit that's bothering me about this comp, and that is that the mirrored little tear here looks a bit unrealistic. It's becoming obvious that there's been a bit of a mirror action going on here, especially with the lighting. So we can now, because we've already done our stabilized jeans in a pre-comp, we can come and fix that up and comp that out. So let's go inside our stabilized jeans. The first thing I'm going to do is lock my composition and then go over to the stabilized jeans. Let's just double click that so it goes into a new window. And I'm going to drag that window over to the side so I can see this completely on both sides. So here's my main jeans, here's my stabilized jeans pre-comp. So in this side, what I want to do is deal with this little rip. So we're going to zoom in here. Now we could do this a number of ways, but I'm going to do like a keyhole matte method. So to do that, I'm going to grab my stabilized jeans. I'm going to pre-comp this layer. So I'm going to do, again, Control or Command Shift C to pre-comp this. I'm going to call this stabilized patch because we're going to patch this little bit out. And I'm going to click OK. So now all the changes that I made with the scale is all inside this stabilized patch pre-comp. Then all I need to do is duplicate this by doing Command or Control D and then drawing a small hole where I want the problem to go away. So we can come up to the standard After Effects ellipse tool here, and I'm going to just draw a little circle around my little problem area. So if we solid this for a second, we can see that it's adding. We want it to subtract. So let's come down to subtract. And now we've got our little hole inside the jeans. So we can now go ahead and use the underlayer to move around and find a nice patch for this hole. So we'll come up to our arrow tool and we can start moving this patch to find a decent place to go. So we can see here there's a bit of a crease happening here, so we probably want to follow that line, and because it's stabilized, it will match quite nicely. We're getting a bit of a hard edge here, so we're going to want to soften this mask here. So I'm going to come into the mask, choose feather, and just scale that up a bit. You don't want to go too far because otherwise it will cut into the original rip here. And we may want to drag this out a little bit. So let's just come into our mask, pull this out, and so we've got a nice fade. Like so. We want to make sure that it's not touching the edge of that pocket there. So let's just scrub through and see how that looks. And that's looking pretty good. So let's go back over to our original comp. I'm going to close that. And now that we've comped in that patch, we can see that it's happened over on our insert. So let's just do a little bit of a pre-cache here and see what that looks like. Okay, so here we have the final shot. So we can see that we've got that nice patch coming through. We've managed to get rid of the tiny rip as well so that it doesn't look too samey on both sides. If we wanted to take this a little bit further, we could go ahead and adjust the lighting around here just so that that mirroring of the light is not so bad. But overall, we can probably get away with that. So it's a nice clean way to stabilize one side, adopt the lighting from that patch, and then insert it over to the other side. There are of course a number of ways we could have handled this. The warp stabilize is still the best way to make sure that the mesh captures all the muscle motion in this side, but we could have used a corner pin over this side, we could have used the inner mask and generated masks over here to speed some things up. But there's multiple approaches when you're using the different Mocha modules inside Mocha Pro 2021 and beyond. For more Mocha tutorials, tips and news, visit us at borisfx.com.